Quick disclaimer, any information that is provided is for educational purposes only. Reference to a commercial product does not constitute an endorsement by the webinar team members or their institutions. And today I am delighted to introduce Dr. Melissa Vilaro, who's an associate professor of health and wellness in the Department of Family, Youth, and Community Sciences at the University of Florida. She previously completed postdoctoral training with a focus on cancer health, communication, and strategic message design at UF STEM Translational Communications Center, where she received a National Cancer Institute research supplement to promote diversity and health-related research. She also worked as a postdoctoral associate at UF's Food Science and Human Nutrition Department, where she coordinated a USDA-funded health promotion and social marketing research study. She earned her PhD in public health and MPH from UF and a BA from Tufts University. As a social behavioral scientist, Dr. Vilaro's research incorporates community-based approaches to develop strategic messaging and behavior change strategies for chronic disease prevention. Her research largely addresses the social and environmental determinants of diet among vulnerable populations, including children, low-income, and rural populations to mitigate diet-related health disparities. Dr. Vilaro's current research addresses cancer screening disparities among rural adults through the development and pilot testing of a culturally tailored web-based intervention that engages rural adults with their personalized nutrition risk information and tailored colorectal cancer screening messages. Additionally, Dr. Vilaro conducts research related to food insecurity, food and beverage advertising among youth, and survey development using a variety of qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And with that, I'd like to turn over today's session one of Cancer, the Science of Prevention and Survival, Cancer Update to Dr. Vilaro.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And I'm really happy to be here today to talk about some of the kind of current research in cancer prevention and also some emerging research. And so we will be using the chat function. So please feel free to type in the chat a couple times during the talk, and just excited to be starting. So let me just... So today's learning objectives, we will be covering kind of three broad objectives. So to begin with, we'll go over prevention as a general concept and then focus on evidence-based recommendations for cancer prevention. And we will also, in that context of cancer prevention, be talking about modifiable risk factors. So by the end of the talk, you should be able to identify specific modifiable risk factors and how they're related to cancer prevention and the proportion of preventable cancers that they're related to. And then also we'll talk about some current and emerging research related to cancer prevention and intervention strategies. So this is just a brief outline. As I mentioned, we'll be talking about some current research, and we'll also be talking about the future of prevention. And so when we think about prevention, it might look different in a few years as we all kind of have been kind of immersed into this technological world of kind of communicating with technology through technology. Prevention is not any different than kind of our current world. And so there's a lot of emerging technologies and health information technology. So I'll briefly cover that. But as we think about prevention, it might be even broader than some of the things we've traditionally seen. And so on that note, to begin, I'd love to just take a few seconds to have everyone type in the chat the answer to this question. So what is cancer prevention? And not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but I'm really just curious to know what you as a health professional identify as cancer prevention. And so any term or concept or research topic that you think of as cancer prevention, please type it in the chat now. And as you type in the chat, I'll just kind of take a look and make a note that all of us come likely from different backgrounds, work in different parts of the country, and might be working with different communities. And so our idea of prevention could vary a lot across our different experiences. And so I see a lot of nutrition, lifestyle choices, screening, avoiding smoking, actions. And so, yeah, I see a lot of people are probably working in the realm of nutrition and lifestyle, behavior change, food. We got a lot of food kind of comments here, some screening. And so, yeah, you can kind of get a sense of what others are doing or what others perceive as prevention. And so I'd like you all to keep an open mind when it comes to prevention, and hopefully I can give you a sense of some new ideas, some things we're not familiar with. So cancer prevention, as it's defined, is traditionally, as many of you were posting in the chat, seen described as action taken to decrease the chance of getting a disease or a condition. So spot on. Many of you almost word for word got this definition. And then cancer prevention specifically includes avoiding risk factors and increasing protective factors. So things I saw in the chat: avoiding smoking, increasing healthy foods, nutrition. And this figure here is kind of a summary of a lot of the chat comments from the World Cancer Research Fund. They give an overview of kind of the overall way of living healthy to prevent cancer. And this is a really great site and resource. If you're not familiar with it, I would suggest kind of exploring it, because they have a lot of great evidence-based research and guides for cancer prevention. So specifically, I wanted to make a note. I did see a few people post screening as a cancer prevention strategy, and that also screening, while traditionally kind of more commonly, I guess, is seen as an early detection, cancer screening can both be prevention and early detection. And so it is important to note that screening is prevention if it identifies a precancerous cell. So for example, when we think of the cancer control continuum, as we see here, which is a framework that has been used since about the mid-1970s, it really is describing the phases of cancer from its early etiology up through survivorship and the end of life, and all of the different points we can focus on. And screening kind of is one of those things that falls kind of in between prevention and detection. And so when screening is used, for example, like in colorectal cancer, to identify polyps or precancerous cells before they become cancerous, then it's considered a prevention tool. But oftentimes screening is important for early detection. And so it can detect early stage cancers. And as with colorectal cancer, it's really important because when we 90% of colorectal cancers are actually treatable if caught early. And so screening is one of those things that kind of falls in between prevention and detection. And then, of course, as we think about the continuum, or we think about cancer as a continuum, all of these things can be interrelated. So it's best to kind of think about them not as necessarily discrete categories, but a framework to help us think about where we focus our programs or research, or where we might want to collaborate with other people, or what are the needs in a community. So this is a really nice, if you're not familiar with the cancer controlled continuum, it can help you identify different areas of research and practice. And so in terms of incidence, which is essentially new cancer cases, this study actually came out this week, and every year they post an update about cancer incidence. And it is projected that in 2022, there will be approximately almost 2 million cancer cases diagnosed. And so that is about 5,250 new cancer cases each day. And here you can see the figure, which it breaks it down by gender. And you can see prostate and breast cancer are the leading new cancer cases in men and women, as well as lung and colon cancer, kind of the top three cancer cases. And so when you think about these numbers, it can be overwhelming, but as a behavioral scientist and someone doing work in prevention, it's a really important opportunity to think about the ways that we can mitigate and prevent some of this morbidity and mortality that will come from these new cases. And so the good news is that there are a lot of modifiable risk factors when it comes to cancer. And so there's evidence and research that directly links things like diet, environmental exposures, obesity, physical activity, alcohol, tobacco, and some infections to cancer risk. And so based on studies and different types of research, organizations like the CDC, the National Cancer Institute, and others can put out cancer prevention recommendations. And so there are categories of cancer risks, but also cancer prevention recommendations that you can see kind of on the right hand side there. This is just kind of an overview, and of course it doesn't, this is not a comprehensive list of all the modifiable risk factors and all of the cancer prevention recommendations, but it gives you kind of a general idea of the types of things we can be targeting with research and or community education or interventions. And it's also important to note that what distinguishes a modifiable risk factor from other risks is that there are things you can change. And so there are certain cancer risk factors that we can't change, like age and our genes and even some environmental exposures. And so understanding what those are is important, but when we're trying to educate and make change, we really do want to focus on some of these modifiable risks. And so another opportunity to type in the chat, and again, just take a few seconds to take a guess. Given that there's things that we can do to change our risk profile, what percent, if we were to engage in all of these modifiable risk factors, take a guess as to what percent of all new cancer cases are preventable. So we learned that there's in 2022, an estimated 5,000 new cancer cases a day. What percent of those could we potentially prevent, theoretically, based on evidence? And so I see a lot of high numbers, 65, 50, 85, 50. So it looks like we're ranging from anywhere from 30. We've got some 45, 90. Okay, so yeah, we have a large range, and so it looks like we skew on the positive side of life, which is great as an audience. And so I will give you a couple seconds to put your guess in, and before we go to the next slide. And the good news is that many of you were right in the ballpark. Among U.S. adults, it's an estimated 42% of all new cancers are potentially preventable. And so this is from a study that was published in 2018. It uses data from 2014, but a large survey of adults age 30 and over, a systematic review, and it found that overall, when you think about all of these risk factors, about 42% of all new cancers are preventable, which is, as a behavioral scientist, someone who works in cancer prevention, that's great. And then you can kind of see it breaks it down into some of the more discrete factors. So smoking accounts for 19% of the cases, excess body weight accounts for 8% of cases, alcohol 6%, so on and so forth. And many of you mentioned nutrition and diet. So collectively here at the bottom, diet, so either eating too much of the risk factors or not enough of protective factors, contributes to about 4.5 new cases. So we can change, and that's great when we're working with different communities. And so that's just a little overview. But what I would love to do is now just start to talk a little bit about some of the research related to cancer prevention. So shifting gears a little bit from some of the overarching statistics and prevention stats to thinking about what does the research say about some of these modifiable risk factors. So to begin with, I wanted to talk about a study that was conducted related to meditation and yoga as cancer prevention. I found this study not that long ago. It was published in 2021. One of the authors is at the University of Florida, and it's a large multi-institution study. But it was really interesting to see this research study posed as related to cancer and potentially cancer prevention, because a lot of research with meditation and yoga, it's very common in cancer research. I think, most prevalent. It's conducted with cancer survivorship or cancer treatment, even to kind of see its effects on quality of life or other factors. But this is one of the first studies that I came across that really kind of framed it as a potential cancer prevention tool. So meditation and yoga maybe will be kind of the future of prevention in terms of one of these modifiable risk factors that we keep learning more about. So for this study, the researchers wanted to explore how an 8-day meditation retreat impacts gene expression. So they were really interested in what were kind of the cellular pathways, what is the mechanism of meditation, and how might it be related to what's going on at a cellular level in people's bodies. And so they analyzed whole blood gene expression. So they essentially took blood samples and did profiling on it. And so I won't go into detail on those procedures as a social behavioral scientist, but I would recommend looking at the paper. It was really interesting. And essentially they looked at oxidative stress, detoxification, and different cell cycle regulation pathways to try to look at what was the impact of meditation on participants' genes. And so the participants actually spent 8 days in complete silence with more than 10 hours of meditation per day. They were on a strict vegan diet, and they were required actually for 2 months before the retreat to be on the vegan diet. So it was a very tightly controlled study, and not necessarily a generalizable population, but really as far as data quality and being able to look at the effect of meditation on some of these outcomes, really important that they had this tightly controlled study. And so it was actually a longitudinal study. They enrolled, they took, at the figure at the bottom kind of shows the timeline of the study. So they took blood samples from participants 6 weeks before the retreat, on the day of the retreat before it started, and then immediately after the retreat is T3 or time 3. And then again, they followed up with participants at time 4, so 3 months after the retreat. And so they're taking blood samples at each of these time points from participants, and they have also blood samples from participants who did not participate in the retreat, and they can look at the effect of meditation through their analyses. So what did they find? They found that meditation, through a number of their analyses, activated genes associated with the immune system. And so really interestingly, they looked at several immune signaling pathways, and they showed that for the folks who meditated, they had enhanced immune function, and which did not activate inflammatory signals. So apparently they took this literature and these findings together with, which correlated with previous findings to basically say that behavioral interventions that include meditation could be potentially efficacious for treating various conditions associated with a weakened immune system. And so one of the things they looked at were IFN responses, which are related to immunity and are a common immune defect in human cancer. And so one of their conclusions is that meditation is enhanced or supported immediately after meditation. So at this time 3, immediately after the retreat, but also at time 4. So 3 months after the retreat, they still found that these pathways, the immune responses and the oxidative stress, were supporting immunity. And so potentially it suggests that behavioral interventions can use meditation related to immune responses. And certainly cancer is one of those conditions where, if we can continue to look at the research and think about ways that, persistent inflammation could be mitigated as a tool for cancer prevention, the role of research in understanding exactly how this plays out, I think, is really exciting for cancer prevention and potentially one of the things that we might see more of in the realm of prevention. And just kind of interestingly, only 14% of U.S. adults use yoga or meditation. This is from a survey in the previous year. So it's potentially something that people maybe aren't aware of, and maybe more people, there's a large population of people out there maybe who can try this for the first time. And so potential for cancer prevention, but I think the research is kind of ongoing in this area. Now I'm bringing it down a little bit now to a more practical application of meditation and yoga as it relates to cancer prevention. And so most of us are probably not going to meditate for 8 days in a row or 10 hours a day. And so the practicality of that study design necessarily is not something we'll be talking and educating our community members and clients on. But there are other ways to kind of look at the literature with cancer prevention and yoga and meditation. And so this pilot study is a great example of how they use yoga, vinyasa yoga, which includes a combination of physical activity and meditation for smoking cessation. And as you probably know, smoking is one of the leading causes of cancer. And so on the right, you can see all of the cancer cases and deaths that are attributable to smoking. So certainly an important research question if yoga can enhance smoking cessation as kind of a precursor to cancer. So just another way to think about studying cancer prevention. And in this pilot study, they actually enrolled 55 women smokers who participated in an 8-week group-based cognitive behavioral therapy treatment for smoking cessation, which is a pretty standard type of intervention for behavior change. But what they did was they added on either 2 times participating in yoga twice a week or a wellness control. And they wanted to look at between the 2 groups if people how people responded to the intervention and was it able to help them abstain from smoking. And they measured that with a saliva test. So similar to the previous study, they did it at the end of the intervention at 3 months and then a 6-month follow-up. And interestingly, what they found was that at the end of the intervention, they measured quitting in 2 different ways, but essentially both halves of this table here are showing that at 8 weeks, the yoga group had a higher quit rate compared to the wellness group. And this was a significant relationship here. So at 8 weeks, the yoga group were more likely to had a higher odd of having quit based on this 7-day quit outcome. And as well as just using they used another version of this quit outcome, 24-hour quit. Same thing at the end of the intervention. It was significantly more likely that the yoga group had better odds of quitting compared to the wellness group. They also looked at this at 3 months and found that while it wasn't statistically significant, the yoga group still maintained a higher percentage or higher rate of quit for both outcomes. And so implying that this yoga intervention or the addition of yoga onto CBT therapy for smoking cessation was helpful for getting people to quit at least immediately after. Now, long-term behavior change is a challenge for any type of behavior change. And so they didn't necessarily see that, but it's promising in terms of immediate change. And so, of course, I think cancer prevention is no different than any other behavior change. The long-term strategies are really important when you think about change. But this, as a first step, they had a great finding. And so what they actually did was they translated this to a larger clinical trial. And now they included both men and women. And they randomized people again to yoga. You can see that the type of yoga changed. So they probably learned some things in their first yoga trial. And they added a type of yoga that included some blocks and props that was maybe slightly more accessible to the participants. And again, they had the wellness control. And similarly, again, they assessed the 7-day point prevalence abstinence. So people who had quit smoking at the end of the program at 3 months and at 6 months. And again, what they found was that yoga participants had a 37% greater odds of achieving abstinence than controls at 8 weeks. So again, the intervention was effective immediately after. And then they also looked at some sub-analyses and found that for every yoga class attended, it increased the odds of quitting by 11%. And so this is this idea of dose and how much of an intervention is effective, and if you do more, is more better. And in this case, I'm sure they kept track of maybe some people missed a class or two. If it was twice a week, maybe there was a couple weeks where people couldn't make it. And so they analyzed that data and did see that for every class you attended, the odds of quitting were increased by 12%. So that's kind of an interesting finding. And then they also did some analyses and determined that the yoga intervention actually might be more effective for smokers who are lighter smokers compared to the heavier smokers. And so here it's this idea of thinking about audience. And so when you're implementing a program or an intervention, there might be certain groups of people that it works better for, or it works worse for, or maybe there are tweaks needed for different groups. And so this is this kind of concept of audience segmentation, or just understanding who your audience is and what for whom certain components of an intervention might be effective for. And I think it's just always kind of good to keep in mind that just because it doesn't work for someone, it doesn't mean it doesn't work as a whole. And we might need to find different strategies to engage people for whom a certain intervention doesn't work. I thought this was also, just related to that last comment, an interesting graph. They also decided to look at patterns of quitting behavior. And so not looking at the groups, yoga versus wellness control, but they looked at the study population as a whole among all the participants, just looking at what were the patterns of quitting. And this is, they did some analyses which suggested that a 4-class model was actually best supported by the data. So you can kind of see all these squiggly lines here, but essentially by week 4 is when people started to quit. Not too many people were quitting. The odds of quitting before week 4 were pretty low. So from a practical perspective, this data can help them understand that, okay, we need at a minimum 4 weeks. If we did an intervention, if we did this intervention and planned 3 weeks, we're probably selling ourselves short, selling the participants short. We're not going to get the effects, but so they can learn that for at least 4 weeks is kind of a good plan in terms of the amount of dose of the intervention people need. So it showed that 16% of people quit by week 4. And this blue line shows that by the end of the intervention, most of them, those quitters at week 4, remained quit at the end of the intervention. They also looked at different other patterns of quit. So these, what they called the slow quitters, 5% of people quit by week 3 and maintained also a high rate of quit by the end of the 8 weeks. So the probability of quitting among those was pretty good, but they had just a slow and steady pace. And then there were also, they looked at non-quitters. So 71%, so most of the study sample actually never quit, which is this orange line on the bottom. And then 8% of people quit by class 3, but then relapse. So there's these kind of relapsers. And so looking at patterns of quit kind of helps you understand maybe this group, this yellow line, like there's something about this group maybe here that's happening at week 4 that's causing them to relapse. And so if you're thinking about how to tailor an intervention to an audience, this yellow line, people that kind of follow this pattern might be really interesting to follow, because they've shown that they can initiate the change, but they can't sustain it the same way this other group does. And so in terms of research, it's kind of a really interesting idea to think about, who are these people? What are their characteristics? How can I engage them? And just of note, kind of study related note, yoga participants were more likely to be in the patterns represented by the blue and the gray lines. Okay, so now we're shifting gears again and kind of talking about communicating nutrition risk factors as cancer prevention. So I mentioned the World Cancer Research Fund website at the top of the talk. And this is a link to the interactive cancer risk matrix. And if you haven't visited this site, I would highly suggest it, recommend it. It's kind of just a fun site. If you're interested in a specific type of cancer, the nice thing about it is that you can filter by cancer type. And so this is kind of an image of the overall way that nutrition, diet, and physical activity either decreases or increases risk for cancer. So at the top of the screen, these are all factors that decrease risk, things that are protective, and at the bottom indicate the red circles and orange circles increase risk. And the colors are coordinate with the strength of the evidence, and the size of the circles actually relate to the number of cancer cases. So the bigger the circle is kind of indicating that that risk factor has a bigger impact on overall cases. And so you can filter by cancer, or you can click on if you're interested in just looking at how does fast food relate to cancer. And looking at it by the risk factor, you can do that. So again, just a plug for this as a really great resource. And so I'm going to focus on just a few of the risk factors, because as you saw, there's a lot of circles there. So we could probably talk for a long time about all the different types of risk factors in cancer and cancer prevention. But alcohol is actually one of the leading I think about 6% of cancers, and by cancer type actually has a large impact on cancer risk, and there's pretty strong evidence to indicate that. Breast cancer has been one of the cancers that most people are familiar with, but alcohol is also related to cancer of the mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, and colorectal cancer. And so this survey here kind of shows that in 2020, just under about half of Americans are drinking at least one drink a week. And it is important to note that, based on data, alcohol use is actually increasing in the U.S. And so it's kind of an important thing to keep track of in terms of cancer prevention, but also alcohol use, when you look at who it's increasing among, rates or data showing that women, racial ethnic minorities, and people with lower SES are kind of increasing their use, as well as there's actually some data to indicate that in the past few years with COVID, rates of alcohol use have been increasing as well. And so in terms of cancer prevention, there is a significant potential impact of addressing this risk factor and to support prevention goals. And so I mentioned breast cancer. There's actually a long kind of body of research that's consistently found that alcohol is associated with breast cancer risk. And in terms of kind of how much alcohol, it indicate one of the studies at the bottom below, I have it on the link there, but basically they looked at, they pooled data from 118 individual studies, and they found that the risk increase, it increased slightly for light drinkers, and then it increased proportionately for moderate and heavy drinkers. And so even light amounts of drinking contribute to breast cancer risk. And then overall, findings indicate that about 1 in every 8 cases of breast cancer in women is linked to alcohol. And so from a prevention standpoint, we could if we address this issue of alcohol, we could potentially prevent 1 out of every 8 cases of breast cancer. This graph here is from the HINTS data set, and they just asked, surveyed Americans to try to understand perceptions of alcohol cancer risk. And basically asked, do you think cancer can result from drinking too much alcohol? And you can see the results here. So about 30% of people said yes, 30% of people said no, 23% of people said no, and 36% said, I don't know. And so there's a large proportion of people, the yellow and the green, who actually either don't know if there's a link or think that there is not a link. And so again, awareness of this is something that is can be improved upon. And as health educators, people working with communities in the area of cancer prevention, it's kind of our first step. And there are initiatives and calls to kind of increase awareness and promotion of the role of alcohol as it relates to cancer. And so from a practical perspective, effectively communicating that alcohol use increases cancer risk is just kind of a general way that we can talk about alcohol and cancer risk. But of course, that statement sounds a lot easier than probably it is. And so, how we talk about cancer risk and alcohol, the effectiveness and the source and the way we're communicating these messages can be really complicated. And then understanding how it actually impacts behavior change, as we have kind of discussed, long-term behavior change can be really challenging. And so we can think about different strategies like targeted messages and programs. And so thinking about messages might need to be tailored for people who are unaware of the link. So people in this yellow don't know, they just don't know that there's a link. So increase awareness. And then maybe there needs to be a different message for people who think there is no link. So it's a little bit different because we're correcting misinformation, and maybe that has to be a slightly different message. And so we can think about different ways to target different audiences. And then we can also think about culture and culturally tailoring messages, which I'll talk a little bit about with some of my work with rural adults and talking about these risk factors. And so for the past year or so, 2 years probably, I've been doing some work in cancer communication as it relates to colorectal cancer. I mentioned colorectal cancer. I think it's the second leading cause of death, cancer deaths among men and women. And alcohol is one of the risk factors with strong evidence. Data indicates that risk increases for every 10 grams of ethanol per day. And so 10 grams is about one serving of alcohol. So you can even just one serving of alcohol increases risk. And in general, recommendations for cancer prevention related to alcohol are to limit or avoid alcohol. Similarly, for colorectal cancer, red and processed meats are the two other nutrition risk factors, so things that increase the risk for colorectal cancer. And so for red meat, a survey of awareness, it was the Cancer Risk Awareness Survey. This is from 2019. They surveyed adults and found that only 43% of people were aware that diets high in red meat increased cancer risk, and only 53% of adults were aware that diets high in processed meats increased cancer risk. And so when you look at the cancer prevention recommendations, they're essentially for red meat to eat moderate amounts of red meat. And for processed meats, they actually say, avoid or eat little, if any, processed meat, save it for a special occasion. So I've been working for the past few years to try to figure out ways to communicate these nutrition risk factors to adults. And one of the ways I have worked with my colleagues to do that is using technology. So just going to briefly kind of talk about technology and its potential role in cancer prevention. And one health information technology that's kind of emerging is this idea of a virtual health assistant, or a virtual clinician, or a virtual, in this case, cancer survivor. So virtual health assistants are essentially what you see here, an animated character, but they're easily modifiable, so you can tailor them for language. The study that I'm a part of has Spanish language and English language versions. You can tailor appearance, so male, female, different skin tone. You can change the voice and also obviously the content. So more than just the message, there are a lot of things that you can change about the VHA with very little, production time, and you can kind of test messages and change things as you go, which is kind of one of the appeals of creating messages with this technology. The CDC actually currently uses a virtual health assistant. Actually, they have a simulated cancer survivor named Linda. So that's the image you see there. So she is positioned as a survivor and kind of talks people through different cancer-related topics. And then also at the University of Florida, there's currently a clinical trial that is using virtual health assistance to promote colorectal cancer screening, and specifically targeting rural adults who have not, or adults living in rural areas of Florida who have not been screened for colorectal cancer. And so I'll just play a little preview of the virtual health assistant being used at UF, and her name is Alex.
I'm Alex. I'm your virtual healthcare assistant with UF Health. It's nice to meet you. Before we get started, you should know that it's best to finish your appointment in one sitting. So start when you have time for your appointment and some follow-up questions about your experience. When you're ready to start, please tap Let's Begin or tap Remind Me Later, and I'll follow up with you in a bit.
Okay, so that's Alex. And one of the nice things about using virtual clinicians is that it's a novel way to engage a patient population or a clinical population. And I mentioned we're using this to promote colorectal cancer screening. And prior to implementing that clinical trial, we did some pilot testing of the virtual health assistants, because we wanted to just understand a little bit more about how patients would interact with this type of technology. And as kind of background literature, there is strong evidence that shows that screening rates increase just from a doctor or clinician recommendation. And so that's one of the kind of indicators of improving screening rates is if someone gets a recommendation from their doctor, they're more likely to screen. And so for this pilot test, we had a large sample, just over 1,000 adults, and we wanted to see if interacting with the virtual health assistant would increase their intentions to talk to a doctor about colorectal screening. And what we found was that it did significantly increase intentions to talk to a doctor about colorectal cancer screening. And so that was one of the findings, and the link to the paper is there because there's a few other sub-analysis that we did. But in general, kind of a general positive outcome related to if someone interacted with this clinician, they were more likely to have intentions to talk to their doctor about screening, and hopefully get a recommendation and be screened. And so this was piloted among people who were currently outside of guidelines for screening because they were between 50 and 73 years old, which based on recommendations, anyone older than at the time of the study 50, and now it's been lowered to 45 should have been screened. And so these were people who were outside of guidelines. And so positive data to support the fact that this could help encourage people to talk to their doctors. And so I was really interested in looking at how I could use the virtual human to talk about nutrition risk factors. And so for colorectal cancer, like we just discussed, alcohol and red and processed meats. And so I essentially have been developing a prototype that uses a virtual health assistant to talk about the risk factors. And then I will be piloting with adults at a national sample to see if it changes their risk perceptions, their intentions to screen, and their information seeking behaviors. And so that is ongoing. But we've completed aim 1 of the study, which is to develop the prototype. And one of the things that I love about this project is that I was able to talk to just under 50 adults. And this was started before COVID. And so I did 2 focus groups in person pre-COVID, which is, you can see the picture there, participants doing kind of a image sorting activity to kind of talk about different types of foods and processed meat and images that they'd want to see in a prototype. And then COVID hit and I had to move all of my interviews and focus groups to Zoom, but was still able to collect 48, enroll 48 participants. And we learned a lot. This figure in the middle here is the version of the prototype. So, and you can see the kind of coded script below. It allowed us to conduct a couple of focus groups, take the feedback from participants, adapt the text, test it again, and kind of learn from participants as we were going about what was working, what wasn't working, and create kind of a scripted content that was really user-centered and based on what was kind of acceptable and engaging for the people we were working with. And so some of the things we learned early on, we learned a lot of interesting things, and we're still analyzing the data and kind of publishing on the data. But kind of one of the most interesting things was how some people were responding to the idea of alcohol as a risk factor. And a lot of people responded negatively to being told that alcohol was a risk factor, and specifically to the message that the cancer prevention recommendation was to avoid alcohol. And so one of the versions, after we kind of identified that as kind of an recurring thing, we ended up adding in, if you are a little piece of scripted content that said, if you're going to drink, stay within, general guidelines, which say, 1 drink a day for women, no more than 2 drinks a day for men. We tested that new script and found that it actually made it worse. People were even more upset, and it actually kind of seemed to affect the credibility of the message, because people were saying, well, you told me that I should avoid alcohol for cancer prevention. But then immediately after, she said, if I'm going to drink, to stay within national guidelines. So we kind of learned quickly that we were trying to make it better, but we ended up actually making it worse. And so that iterative process and really talking to community members and people for whom a message is meant can help you understand how they're engaging with it. And so this has been a really great learning process, I think, because creating something with communities, and especially technology with older adults, we were testing technology through technology, which was at first a challenge, but actually worked really well, and perhaps in some ways better. We learned maybe even more than we would have if we were in person. And so I would just encourage people to not shy away from technology or health information technologies as an effective way to engage with cancer prevention in the community. And so that is pretty much where kind of the current state of cancer prevention is, from kind of the existing and maybe emerging research, and then thinking about how technology can be used with different types of communities and different settings. And as a call to action, I know people are working in likely very different communities. So just kind of things to think about as you plan your extension programs or research programs or health communication tools, to think about strategic message design. There's a lot we can learn from research, so research-based evidence, what messages might work for different people. Those insights from different research studies can help you make a plan for message design, as well as considering audience needs and different identities, as we kind of saw with the caveat that the one study mentioned about the intervention potentially working better for light smokers compared to heavier smokers. So those types of things can help us inform our programs. And in general, thinking about getting the right person, the right place, the right time, and the right message, those kind of 4 components of strategic messaging. And then in general, presenting health information, whether it's virtually or in person, source perceptions matter. So we learned from our participant engagement that we could really damage credibility based on tweaking a message in a way that we thought would help. And so obviously that's not something you want to do when you're communicating health messages that you want people to engage with. And so, just thinking about how do you asking people how they're responding to messages and how they're perceiving the source of the message is important. And noticing and maybe talking about the difference between cancer prevention guidelines versus general guidelines for health. And so how those might differ for different disease conditions or prevention goals. There's a lot of work to be done in cancer prevention. So hopefully a lot of opportunity to make specific actionable plans for extension programs. And I hope this was helpful. So I would thank you for your time. I also, before I end, would love to acknowledge some of my co-investigators on the main study and all of the research participants and community advisory board members who have helped with my research in different stages of conception and implementation, as well as the panelists for inviting me to speak today, and the research study funded by the NCI Diversity Supplement as well. And so with that, here are some resources that I would recommend if you're looking for cancer prevention information. And I will open it up for questions if we have time.
We definitely have time. Thank you, Melissa. We had one question, and I believe it was regarding the meditation yoga study. And the question was related to, did that study support a plant-based vegan diet also as another interpretation of that study?
Yeah, good question. And I actually forgot to mention that they did some analyses which controlled for the diet. And they actually said that the effects of the meditation were above and beyond what could be attributed to diet. So whatever portion of the outcomes they found that were related to the vegan diet, they were able to confirm essentially that the effects of the meditation were above and beyond that. Now, the paper is linked in the study, so you could probably go in and look at the details, but I do remember kind of they specifically highlight that. And that's a really important part because they had everyone kind of on the standard vegan diet. So they did some analyses with the control group to see that. So they were able to say that the effect of meditation was, the initial, or taking out the effects of sleep and the timing of the sample and the diet were things that they specifically looked at in their analysis.
Thank you. Dr. Vilaro, thank you so much for today's talk. It was riveting. When you were talking about yoga, I hope everyone joined me. I got up and did some yoga myself as I was listening in. It's not 10 hours, but it was a good start.